Here at Manor Park Classics, we've just sold this phenomenally cool, beautiful and restored Peugeot 309 GTI. In fact, this one has been augmented by the fitment of an MI16 engine from the larger 405 saloon. Now, Peugeot in the 1980s were widely considered to be the kings of the hot hatch. But today, rather than go through all that story again that so many people always talk about, I'm going to take the opportunity of having this 309 here just before it goes to its new owner to tell you a bit of a story about how this car was an orphan and how its legacy of its conception and its life has just come full circle only in the past few years. Now, this car is 40 years old. I don't know exactly when this example's from. It's an F-reg, so it's 1988, 1989, there or thereabouts. But the 309 as a whole is about 40 years old. But it is just in the past few years that this story has existed in the form it has. Because at the time, although this car has Peugeot mechanical components, it has Peugeot styling, and it even has a Peugeot badge on the back, of course, this car isn't really a Peugeot. Instead, this car was going to be launched. It was conceived to be the Talbot Arizona. Now, that's a car you'll never have heard before because it didn't exist. This is the Talbot Arizona, just with Peugeot badges on it. You see, the Talbot brand is very old. It's been around for, I think, over 120 years now, and it's been dormant for the vast majority of those. However, it was reborn in the late 1970s as the husk of Chrysler Europe. Now, Chrysler had never been a big deal in Europe, and in order to get us to the point where Chrysler join in, we need to go back to the turn of the 20th century, back when Talbot themselves were infants, but that's not really what we're talking about. Instead, we're talking about the American invasion of the European market, and Britain as well in particular, most probably. You see, in the first decade of the 20th century, Ford built a production plant in Manchester and entered the British market. Now, at the time, Ford weren't huge in Britain, and they certainly weren't huge in continental Europe, but over the coming decades, they built themselves into a giant, absolutely on the money, the top of the world by the mid-1960s. It took them some time, of course, but they did get there. And similarly, General Motors, who were another of the American big three, wanted a slice of the European market. And so in the 1920s, they bought Vauxhall in Great Britain and Opel in Germany. Those two marques are icons of their respective nations, building some of the most popular, decently regarded, but yeah, popular cars of their time. And by, again, the 1960s, Vauxhall and Opel were huge, mainstream, massively high-volume brands. Ford and General Motors had therefore cracked the European market, and the other of the American big three, Chrysler, weren't in on it. Chryslers were incredibly rare in Europe. They just did not have a presence. And to be fair, Chrysler don't today either. But at the end of the 1960s, they decided they wanted to do something about it. And like General Motors, they decided to buy in to an existing European success story. Success story is probably over-egging it ever so slightly because they wanted to buy a company that wasn't going to cost them an arm and a leg, that they could potentially revitalize. And so in Great Britain, they decided to buy the Rootes Group. Now, the Rootes Group was an amalgamation of all different marques that had slowly formed itself since the early 1920s, or even in the 1910s maybe. It was a combination of the likes of Hillman, Humber, Sunbeam, Singer, Commer, all these old British marques, none of which exist anymore, but they were building cars in the 1960s that were very popular. They were building the Hillman Hunter and the Hillman Imp. In the more luxury-facing segment, they had cars like the Humber Super Snipe, for example. All cars that we don't really remember today, but maybe the Imp is the best known of them. A mini competitor with its engine at the back, designed to be cheaper, and a lot of people believe the Imp was better than the Mini. Rootes were a big company, but unfortunately, they were faltering. The 1960s were not a great decade for British industry, and they were not a great decade either for the British motor industry. Most famously, Austin, Morris, Jaguar, Rover, Triumph and the like all merged, should I say, into the infamous British Leyland. Now, of course, that wasn't a success story. They went bust, reformed, dropped loads of marks on the way, and now the British motor industry is very small indeed, at least relatively to how it was. Roots, on the other hand, went a different path. They accepted a buyout offer from Chrysler. And at the same time, Chrysler bought Simca in France. And by 1970, certainly, Chrysler Europe had been formed. The old Roots Group marks had been slowly dropped away, seeing us lose the likes of Hillman, and in the UK, cars like the Hunter and its successors would be badged as Chryslers. So by the mid-1970s in Britain, we had cars like the Chrysler Alpine, we had the Chrysler Horizon and the Chrysler Sunbeam, those three being a range of three different cars that were all quite popular in Britain in that period, but the key is that they were badged as Chryslers. Now, in France, they were badged as Simcas, of course, as the two Roots and Simca kind of merged in their car design studios, and so certain parts of the company did the styling. The engineering was really all down to Simca. Styling was really done in the UK by what used to be Roots. And this meant that Chrysler had control of not just big British and French concerns, but also British and French factories. The problem is that the 1970s were even worse than the 1960s. And Chrysler were funneling money into their European subsidiary, trying to get something out of it, but they really couldn't. Yes, their cars were quite successful, they were common, they were, amongst the best sellers, but they weren't making profits, and they weren't quite as successful as they'd really hoped them to be. As a result, Chrysler took the shocking decision after less than 10 years in Europe to just pull out, to just sell, to lose everything they'd worked for. And so in 1978, Chrysler Europe became an orphan. The solution for them was to be bought by PSA, Peugeot, from France, who at the time had just swallowed up Citroën themselves and were becoming a total giant on the continent. Peugeots were rugged, dependable cars that weren't particularly desirable at this point in the late 1970s, but Peugeots were good, solid cars. The kind of cars that would last for 1 million miles and would be seen in deserts and in rural Africa being mended with a hammer and a piece of string. Peugeots were solid cars. And so Peugeot swallowed up Citroën in the early 1970s, who were failing financially. And then in 1978, they swallowed up Chrysler Europe too. The problem is that in Britain, at least, all these cars were badged as Chryslers. And suddenly they couldn't use the Chrysler name anymore. So PSA decided to rename the entire division as Talbot, bringing in one of the former marks of these two former giants in Roots and Simca in order to bring them under one mark for the first time ever. And so all the cars that were being built were suddenly rebadged as Talbot. So we had the Talbot Alpine, we had the Talbot Horizon, and we had the Talbot Sunbeam suddenly. The next generation of Talbot cars then started being developed, of course with the oversight of Peugeot and a lot of Peugeot mechanical componentry underneath. Why start developing new engines when you've got perfectly good engines sat on the shelf or already being designed by Peugeot? And so the replacement for the Talbot Horizon was going to be the Talbot Arizona, this car. Now, I'm sure those of us of a certain age would remember that Peugeot Talbot was a kind of single group in the UK, and all those mad 205 Turbo 16 rally cars all had Peugeot Talbot Sport pasted all over them. But Talbot were not long for this world. Peugeot decided that it wasn't in their interest to keep this extra mark rolling alongside Peugeot and Citroën. Peugeot and Citroën could be differentiated in a manner. Citroën building slightly more avant-garde cars, although many of them were based, of course, on contemporary Peugeots. But they didn't see the point of having the Talbot brand. And so by the mid-1980s, they started to funnel Talbot's development line into Peugeot. That's why this car was eventually launched as the Peugeot 309. And you'll notice that 309 is not in line with Peugeot's conventional contemporary numbering system. So at this time, we have cars like the 205, the 405, the 605. The way they badged their cars was to have the first number as the size and then 0 and 5 to indicate the generation. That would then go up to 308, for example, that we know today. So why was this car badged as the 309? That's totally out of step. And the reason being is that only a few years prior, Peugeot had launched the 305, which was a very conservative, quite old-fashioned looking saloon car. It was quite successful, but they saw this car as an opportunity to become a little bit cooler. Much along the lines of the 205 that launched in 1983, the 309 would take Peugeot up into a different dimension in terms of desirability, in terms of style, in terms of performance, most critically with the GTIs. The 205 GTI, the 309 GTI, and the 405 MI16. And taken alongside their rallying successes, their Pikes Peak cars, all that kind of stuff, Peugeot were catapulted into another dimension in terms of desirability by cars like this. A car that initially looked to be a bit of an orphan. A car that was going to be the Talbot Arizona, but lived its life as a Peugeot. So you'd imagine that's kind of where the story ends, but it doesn't. The former Roots assembly plant at Ryton in England continued to be a PSA plant all the way through to 2006, building this car, building the car it was always destined to build, but then later building cars like the Peugeot 306 and Peugeot 206 as well. Ryton on Dunsmore was a huge plant, and now, unfortunately, it has closed. But the Prassy plant, which was Simca's former plant in France, that still works today, building engines and cars and panels, all the kind of things that PSA still needs to exist today. So the legacy of the former Talbot brand, of the former Roots group, of the former Simca, still lives on through the cars of Peugeot today. The symmetry that's just come in the past couple of years, however, is because PSA doesn't exist anymore. Peugeot Citroën decided it would merge at the end of the 2010s with FCA, Fiat Chrysler, which means that now, after 40-odd years worth of this car being a Chrysler orphan, of Chrysler pulling out of Europe quite dramatically and leaving its plants, leaving all its cars and leaving all its employees, on a ledge really, only for PSA to save them, they've now come back. Fiat, Chrysler, Dodge, Ram, Alfa Romeo, of course all these marks, Maserati, Peugeot, Citroën, and now Vauxhall and Opel, as General Motors sold their European branch, have all come into one big group known as Stellantis. So part of the reason for Chrysler's introduction to Europe, General Motors' success, is now part of Chrysler. Chrysler's baby in Europe that they then abandoned in 1978 is also now a part of Chrysler. And the Peugeot 309, formerly the Talbot Arizona, as I have now said a million times, was part of Chrysler's legacy, and now it's part of Chrysler's direct history. So I think that was worth telling. It's just a little story, as a little slightly quieter than usual story about how this car leads an incredibly interesting life if you sit and think about it for quite enough time. So if you like any of the cars that you see in the background, of course, as I said, this car has just been sold. But if you like any of the other cars or would like to see any other kind of cool cars coming in here, I'm looking around, there's a Sierra XR4i over there, which I really like the look of, then please do follow the link in the description, find our website, and come and have a look at Manor Park Classics for yourself.